Welcome to the opening ceremony of the academic year. There are some people still arriving, but we should get started, okay? So we are pleased to have the ceremony here in this place is a wonderful building, and we are being hosted by the Caixa Bank. So let me introduce to Roderick Fernandez, who's our host. Thanks.
Thank you, Ramon. Professor Cooley, thank you all for being here today. In the name of La Caixa Banking Foundation, I am honored to welcome you to the Barcelona Caixa Forum for this inaugural lecture. As many of you know, La Caixa Banking Foundation, formerly La Caixa Savings Bank, is a private, non-profit, philanthropic organization that holds a portfolio of equity stakes in several companies, including a majority stake in CaixaBank, and with the dividends that it receives from these holdings, finances a broad array of activities in Spain and abroad. These activities are focused mainly on four areas. There are social programs aimed at providing opportunities to the most vulnerable, especially the children and the elderly. There are programs that give greater access to culture, the arts, and science to the general population. For instance, with this center, Caixa Forum. There are humanitarian aid projects with a strong emphasis on global health issues, including in collaboration with institutions like the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And last but not least, the La Caixa Banking Foundation also provides support to top education and research. As part of those efforts, there are, for instance, the well-known La Caixa Fellowship programs for graduate studies. These programs have been running for more than 30 years, and some of the past recipients are very well to all of you. Jordi Galí, who's here, Jaume Ventura, Xavier Sala y Martín, and I'm sure that in this auditorium there are some additional recipients, in particular of the Severo Ochoa International Doctoral Fellowships. In addition to this fellowship, La Caixa Banking Foundation also supports a few elite research and education centers. Centers of excellence committed to frontier research. The Barcelona Graduate School of Economics is one of them, and it has been one of them since the day the institution was founded. When the Barcelona GSE was born in 2006, expectations were very high. And it is a pleasure to see how year after year those expectations have been met and have been even surpassed in the face of very tough economic conditions. For all the students that are beginning graduate studies this year at the school, I can only say a few things. One is congratulations for being in this great place. Two, enjoy it. And three, and probably most important, make it even better. It's in your hands. So with that, I welcome you all and thank you very much.
Barcelona GSE is standing with two strong feet of two universities. One is the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona and the other Universitat Pompeu Fabra. So let me introduce to Pellegrí Viader, which is a vice rector of the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Excuse my lack of voice. I lost it these last days. Severe cold, but I'll do my best. Mr. Secretary for Universities and Research, Mr. Chairman of the Board, Mr. Vice Rector for International Relations of the Autónoma University, Professor Cooley, Mr. Fernandez from La Caixa, students, faculty, ladies, gentlemen. I will address mainly students, okay? So faculty should not be thought that I'm leaving them out. But my few words, and which are going to be very brief, are addressed to the students. First of all, I welcome you on behalf of the rector of the Pompeu Fabra and all our community. You will soon discover, when you start your lectures at our Ciutadella campus, that our university is very welcoming. It's small, it's easy to find your way around it, and we would like you to feel very comfortable in it, so we will do our best to have you around us and enjoy your stay with us. I'm sure it is going to be very rewarding, personally and career-wise. Just let me tell you that I think you are very lucky people, you students. You are very lucky people for several reasons. In the first place, you are lucky because at some point you decided to apply to the GSE, and I'm sure this decision was based upon the renowned quality of this institution, which, as you know, was created by UPF, my university, Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, and two other research institutes, the Institut d'Anàlisi Econòmica, IAE, and the Centro de Recerca Economia Internacional, which is the CREI. All of these institutions are top institutions in Europe and the world. I will not insist on the last rankings, but, well, you may have a look at them in papers or wherever. Second, you are lucky because you were accepted. Okay, so you're lucky because you applied, you're lucky because you were accepted. And this, at the same time, is quite a big responsibility, since you must respond to the trust the BGCSE has put on you. But also, your acceptance has to be owing to your excellent academic achievements so far. This means that you are a very interesting group of people. This means that sitting next to you, you must have someone who is very interesting to meet, and possibly someone who is going to become a friend for your life. So consider that, okay? It's an interesting idea. In the third place, you are lucky because you will spend this year here in Barcelona. And you will have no other worry than, well, at least those that come from abroad, you will have no other worry than your studies and your work at the master degree in which you have enrolled. This is an opportunity difficult to come across again in a lifetime. Now you have a whole year in which you can study, you can read, you can write essays, you can discuss with colleagues, with friends, you will have excellent teachers. That means you can, for 1 year, be like in a bubble in which the outer world won't exist. You will be just focused on that. So please, please, take this opportunity and use it well, because it possibly won't repeat in a long time at least. Lastly, you are very lucky, I must mention that, because Barcelona Graduate School of Economics is placed here in Barcelona. And Barcelona, believe me, is one of the more attractive cities in the world, as you probably know. I am sure you will enjoy your stay in this incredible city, which offers you an incredible climate, lots of culture, lots of entertainment as well, an incredible gastronomy, and which is placed in a privileged corner of the Mediterranean, Catalonia. You must try to find some time to visit our country and discover some of the most beautiful places in Europe. Roman Tarragona, that's absolutely outgoing, fantastic. Medieval Girona, which is also a fantastic place. Gobsmacking Costa Brava, which rivals Big Sur in beauty and wildness. For all these reasons, you are very lucky people. Well, and if you are lucky people, then we are lucky institutions because we have you, okay? I'm sure you will never forget this academic year here in Barcelona at the BGSE, but for different reasons, I'm sure you will always forget it. We'll never forget it, sorry. Well, I cannot finish without mentioning this year's Nobel Prize in Economy, Professor Angus Deaton, who is a mathematician turned economist. I am a mathematician myself, and I cannot but rejoice at the concession of the Nobel to a colleague, mainly to someone who has worked in a field that connects microeconomy and macroeconomy, and someone who, in his own words, is concerned with the poor of the world and how people behave and what gives them a good life. Maybe in some years, one of you sitting here is also recognized by his or her contributions to economy. May your work in the future be also useful to the poor people in this very unequal world in which we live. Enjoy your year at BGSE. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the Vice Rector of the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, Professor Luis Quintana.
Thank you very much. Let me address myself also to the students. I would like to say you, first of all, congratulations for the decision you have taken, and thanks also for choosing the graduate school. It's not easy to select among the different graduate schools in the world, and it being in Barcelona can be attractive, but then not necessarily convincing, especially if someone else pays for it. You are participating, if you allow me to say that, in a catchword, fashionable catchword, which is mobility, which is internationalization. You have to move, or the blues would say you gotta move. Now it's our turn to persuade you that this was a good decision, and we have a few months for it. But let me suggest you to take, on the meanwhile, full advantage of the choice. And at least in three aspects: the new academic experience, the new colleagues you will meet, and the new country you will live in. I don't guarantee you will like it all, but I'm quite sure this will change you. And if it's for good, then you will have done already half of the job. Thank you very much.
And let me welcome you again on behalf of the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics. I'm the chairman of the board. And this is also a private foundation for non-profit, which we have these universities and these centers, the 4 units, academic units. But we also have the sponsorship, you can see it there, of the different private members of the board. And this is precisely what creates a strength. In addition, of course, we have a great team of the staff that you will know, and Director Teresa Garcia Milà and the staff will doing a great job first on getting you here, but also getting you through the year. One of our strengths, I will say this strength, is to have a very international top research faculty. We are also a research center composed of these units, and at the international level, we are very well qualified in Europe, and so that's a difference with other places. That you are, in your faculty, you're going to have people on the top of the research in their different disciplines. We have here several masters from economics, finance, competition, trade, to data science, with something in common, which is to use top economic research for applied different aspects in economics and finance, but also to analyze data and so on. Some of you might want to decide and go on to a PhD. We have both PhDs of the Pompeu Fabra and the Autónoma under our umbrella. some of you are going to go into professional activities. This is the 9th year, so next year we have the 10th anniversary. And here's 263 of you, not all of you here, as you can tell, but it's coming from 56 countries. That's extremely international. So that's also part of the experience. To be in a very international place, in an international city, like Barcelona, as has been said, and to spend 1 year. And here you're sitting excited, but also with some anxiety probably, of what is to come. It's going to be very intense. So I'm sorry I have bad news. You might not have time to see all these things that the other was telling you, because it's going to be intense. But this has been said too, you're also going to have friends that you don't know. And when something is intense, time plays strange. Sometimes looks like you have been here doing homeworks and things for way too long. It has only been a few months. Sometimes you will realize it passes very fast. And a year will pass fast. So you really take full advantage of it, take advantage of the city, take advantage of knowing people from all over the world. Because you're going to go back to all over the world. And you can see it, we have it in the web, the map where people have been or they are. And that's very telling. So I'm really looking forward that in July we'll offer the degrees. That's going to be something very exciting. An easy job for me, hard work for you. But you will be well-deserved. And that's the important thing. So here is a relatively new institution, but now we experience. So now we can also tell about the experience that in doing well in the job market and other things. And it's always important to learn from other institutions that had based precisely on the principle of excellence of research and graduate education. New York University has been for a while, and in particular the business school. But what had made a big change has been the 21st century. It has changed the environment of New York, but it has changed as a really top, now in the top 3, 4 business schools. And a major person in making this possible has been Thomas Cooley, was the dean from 2002 to 2010. And this has made a big change. And in particularly, and that's something that even not only just a good friend and co-author, so on, but there is something very specific, which I really want him to be here, and we are pleased that he's here, which is understanding this link between excellence of research and graduate, even in the business world, education. And that has made a big difference there. So, and I learned a lot talking to him about experience. So I'm very pleased to have him here. He's been a professor before at Penn, at Rochester, and now in Santa Barbara too. But also founder of Society of Economic Dynamics, Journal, Review of Economic Dynamics, and other activities. So it's not common to have someone who has been on top of institutions like this, and the administrative responsibilities, and on top of the research. So it's a pleasure to have him here, and today is going to be talking of the demographic deficit, which is a key issue nowadays. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here for the opening ceremonies of this academic year. I'm happy to see so many familiar faces, friends of longstanding and former colleagues in the audience, and I'm happy to see all of you students. And I want to echo the sentiment that was expressed by the previous speaker and tell you that you are indeed very fortunate to have chosen this program, this academic program, because here you have the opportunity to be taught by some of the most distinguished scholars in the field. This is truly an outstanding faculty one you should be proud to be associated with. I'm also happy to have the opportunity to talk to you about some research that's research in progress. It's at an early stage. It's far from finished, but it addresses what I think is an important issue, something I call the demographic deficit. Now, there's a lot of talk about the importance of demography, and it circulates in a fairly loose form in the press and economic research and so on. It occurs constantly in many contexts. Most recently, for example, a lot of the press coverage of the wave of immigrants coming to Europe from North Africa and the Middle East has talked about how these immigrants could actually help Germany because Germany faces an aging and shrinking workforce, and that this wave of immigration could actually increase German prosperity. And many countries throughout history have benefited from immigration. But the key thing is to understand, it seems to me, what exactly is the role of population growth and demographics in understanding how the world is evolving. So another context in which discussions of demographics frequently arises is in the discussion of secular stagnation. Now, I won't read to you this slide. Larry Summers has labeled this slowdown in growth that we have observed in much of the world secular stagnation, and these are some of the reasons he gives for the slowdown. But the essence of secular stagnation is a chronic excess of savings over investment and the falling natural rate of interest. And one of the ingredients driving this process, in this argument anyway, is the declining population growth. Another prominent figure in this discussion is about declining growth is Robert Gordon, who argues that demographics, not just declining productivity or innovation opportunities, is a key element of the slowdown. So what is this slowdown? Well, this graph is taken from some other work that I did. It shows the path of the growth rate of GDP for Japan after post their 1990 crisis, their collapse of the asset bubble in Japan, and for the US and Europe post 2009 collapse. And so in Japan, you see the consequences of their collapse was a lost decade or decades. In Europe, you see what seems to be a lost decade ensuing in the aftermath of the financial crisis. In the US, although it's growing at a very low rate relative to historic experience. So demographics is cited as a key factor in these slowdowns, but how important a factor is it? We all know in some visceral sense that populations in many parts of the world are aging, but how important is that, and why is it important? What is the mechanism by which changing demographics affects economic growth? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a story about that today, and I'm going to start by talking about some facts about demography. Then I'm going to do some what we call in economics growth accounting. If you're not familiar with it yet, you will be by the end of your master's degree course, I'm sure, to tease out what the impacts of demographic changes on growth are. And then I'm going to follow that by I'm going to use very established theory to do that. It's called the solo growth accounting procedures. And these results are just basically arithmetic. But in fact, they're quite striking. And then, if I have time, I may not, I'll try to describe some elements of a model that would capture this, and then I will describe, even if I don't talk about the model in any detail, some results about how this model can be used to project the effects of demographics into the future and give you an estimate of how big the impact of demographic changes is on growth for Japan, which is the only country for which I've completed the simulation so far. Japan, I'm going to focus a lot of my discussion on because that's as far as I've gotten, but also because to some extent it's the most interesting example to start with. An aging and shrinking population that has an aversion to immigration, which is one of the tools that you can use to address demographic issues. So let's first look at a picture of the age distribution of the population for a few countries. This is as of 2013. And what's notable about this is Japan, which has a much bigger left tail in this distribution. That is many older workers. And the transition to that started much earlier. You can see China and the US on this graph as well. Another picture that captures some of the concerns about demographics, people's concerns about demographics. This is a plot of what's called the dependency ratio. So the dependency ratio is the ratio of the population that are between 0 and 14 or 65 and older relative to the total population. So as the dependency ratio rises, that means that the population is supporting a larger number of people who are unable or are less likely to be working. And you see again how extraordinary the path of Japan is. Japan is the line in blue. Their dependency ratio started taking off in the 1990s, and these are projections out to 2050 based on UN population data, and it's projected to get just enormous. Other countries which have similar kind of dire projections are Italy, for example, which has a dependency ratio that at some point gets worse than Japan. And you see that Europe as a whole has rising dependency ratios. The US tapers off, China increases, India's in a period of decline for at least some time. So how do we get to that? Oops, sorry, I went too fast here. Well, we get to that in two parts. One is declining fertility. Okay, so this shows you the picture of fertility over time for the US, Europe, Japan, China, and India. And you can see that in many of these countries it declined early and has continued to decline. Europe has declined a lot. Countries that are below, that have fertility below 2, they're basically below replacement rate. So absent immigration and other things, they're going to experience shrinking populations. You can see that the US is not so bad, China not so bad yet, but Europe and Japan are declining quickly. This gives a breakdown for Europe by sections of Europe, and pretty much across the board in Europe, fertility has fallen below replacement and is projected to remain so. So that's one part of determining the relationship. The other part is life expectancy. At the same time that fertility is declining, people are living longer. So life expectancy has increased, in some cases dramatically. And so once again, Japan is the most interesting example because they had the largest decline in fertility, and they've had the largest corresponding increase in life expectancy. But in all countries, life expectancy is increasing. Now, this is clearly important because it's going to drive the age composition of the population in these countries. And I'll get to that in a minute and talk about why that's important. So this is life expectancy. And again, in Europe, there's not much particular notable about this, except Eastern Europe, in which life expectancy has actually at various points declined and is not rising as quickly as elsewhere in the world. The most striking picture to me is this one, which shows the distribution of life expectancy at various points in time across all countries. And so the furthest right, the yellow path, is the distribution of life expectancy in the most recent data across all countries. So if you compare that with the black line, which is the distribution of life expectancies not that long ago, 1965 to 1970, back then, the distribution of life expectancy was bimodal, meaning there are a lot of countries where life expectancy was short. Life was short, mean, and unsatisfying in a lot of those countries. And that distribution has shifted fairly dramatically to the right. And to some extent, it's a lot less bimodal than it used to be. So there are many fewer countries where life expectancy is very short. And I always take that as a kind of a global evidence that development is, in some sense, development efforts are working, that people are living longer, and we're at least dealing with the causes of mortality better. So life expectancy and fertility translate into the age structure of the population. And so now I want to show you some pictures of what I call the cohort structure of the population. And that's going to turn out to be critical to the research that I'm doing. So this is the cohort distribution for the whole world. And what you see, so this particular picture only projects it out to 2040. Because of data limitations, I couldn't project it further. But it shows you that by 2040, the age distribution, the cohort distribution of the world's population is going to have shifted. We'll have flattened out and have a much longer right tail, meaning simply that there are very many older people in the world by 2040, that these blue spikes rise. And there are many fewer younger people and fewer prime age workers than before. So let's look at some individual countries. This is the projected cohort distribution for the US. And this is projected out to 2100, so it's much bigger. And you see that by 2100, that the decline in young workers is fairly pronounced, and young cohorts is very pronounced, and the rise in older cohorts is very pronounced. So this uses projected fertility and projected changes in mortality to get the population and the age structure, and then estimates the transitions, and that gives us the age structure of the population. So this sort of steady shift towards having many people in these older cohorts that go up, the largest one is 100, or the far right tail is 100 plus. There were essentially no entries in that in earlier years. This is the cohort distribution for Germany, and you can see that Germany actually is changing relatively quickly. It's already changed to having a much older cohort structure, and it's going to continue to do so. This is the projected cohort distribution for Italy. And what's striking is how dramatic the change in the left-hand tail of cohorts is, and how quickly these right-hand cohorts are increasing. This is the projected cohort distribution for Spain. It shares a lot of the characteristics of Italy, and you're going to have many fewer older people to deal with. So, and the age distribution of the population is flattening out, and you see many fewer prime age workers by 2100, by the next century, and many more older people. And then lastly, this is the projected cohort distribution of Japan, and this is probably even more striking because of how quickly Japan changed. Japan has already got a lot of older workers in older cohorts, and already gone through this dramatic shift to the right in the cohort distributions. Now, the evolution of these cohorts is going to be of critical importance for what we do, because the basic logic is this: as the cohort distribution of the population shifts out, the number of workers who are later in their life cycle increases. And we know a lot about how workers vary their work effort over their life cycle. They vary their labor supply decisions. And we're going to talk about two margins of adjustment. The extensive margin, which is the decision to work or not to work, and the intensive margin, which is conditional on working. How many hours are you going to work? So the former is the decision to participate in the labor force, and the latter is conditional on participation. How much does one work? And we, not surprisingly, as workers get older, labor force participation declines significantly, and as workers get older, the hours of work that they put in also declines significantly. So I can come back to talking about demographics in a bit, but first what I want to do, I have a limited amount of time. It's fast running out. I'm going to stick to schedule. I planned this as a 45-minute to an hour talk, and I saw on the schedule I have 25 minutes, but I'm going to almost meet 25 minutes. So I'll talk about these things, but I want to take a first crack at providing some estimates of this, what I call the demographic deficit. And the device I use, as I said earlier, is a tool that's familiar to all economists. It's due to Robert Solow. And Robert Solow wanted to understand how much of economic growth was due to capital deepening, that is more capital per workers, how much was due to increases in number and quality of workers, and how much was due to productivity, a concept called total productivity. So Solow wrote down a production function which described the production of output as a function of capital, labor, and productivity, used estimates of the share of capital in output that were well confirmed by many researchers in the data, and then used data on output, capital growth, labor input to decompose the sources of growth. And since all those were observable but productivity was not, he estimated productivity as the residual of this growth accounting. And that was his big insight. And as I said, it's just arithmetic, but let's apply some of that arithmetic to the demographic problem. Here I consider a production function in which output is a function of productivity, I call A, the ratio of capital to labor, raised to the power alpha, which is the share of capital in output. Population, so I started off by writing this as output per capita and then moved population to the right-hand side. And then labor force over population, which is labor force participation, and then hours of work raised to the 1 minus alpha. So this is the extensive margin, and this is the intensive margin of adjustment. And once again, because these things are all observable data, we can calculate productivity as a residual. And so using what economists do, basically the arithmetic of growth, we take logs and then we can we can decompose the growth of output as the growth in output is equal to the sum of the growth in productivity plus alpha times the growth in the capital labor ratio plus the growth rate of population plus the growth rate of labor force participation plus 1 minus alpha times the growth rate of hours per worker. And that's the decomposition that we use. I use data from the Penn World Table, the latest versions for this talk, and I'm going to look at, in particular, I'm going to look at Spain, Italy, the US, and Japan. So this is the growth accounting for the period from 1990 to 2006. Now, I'm going to look at two periods, 1990 to 2006, and then 2007 to 2011. That's a little arbitrary, but it turns out to be interesting because you can see the effects of the demographics kind of kicking in more forcefully in this breakdown. The 1990s were the lost decade for Japan. It's reflected in their very low growth rate of output. In the United States, the growth rate was about at historical long-run averages. Spain had very high growth rate. Italy was fairly low. The remarkable thing about Spain is that it had a very high growth rate in spite of having very low total factor productivity. And that's not unsurprising probably to a lot of economists. And most of the growth rate was coming from increases in labor force participation. So the last three terms here are the contributions of demographics to growth. So in the case of Japan, the contribution of population growth was negative. Their population was already shrinking because of demographics. Now it's actually shrinking at a much faster rate. Japan is, I think, in the latest data, losing a population at a rate of 1 million people a year. Labor force participation was declining, and hours of work were declining. So adjustments at the intensive margin. So these three things add up to a significant drag on economic growth. And the question is, can we explain? These are the demographic factors. We'll talk a little bit more about the question in a minute. So this shows the same kind of calculation for the period from 2007 to 2011. And so what's notable is that none of these countries were growing, US maybe minusculely. The bigger question is how fast were they shrinking? Productivity was declining in both Italy and Spain, but let's look at the demographics for Japan. So population growth was contributing some negative headwind to their growth. Labor force participation was declining, but a big factor was the decline in hours per work. So when you add these three components up, this constitutes more than 1% drag on economic growth. And this is a huge headwind for an economy to face if it's coming simply because of the aging of the population. That's a big problem. There are a couple other things that are worth noting here that are different, and that is In the US, in Spain, a lot of the drag is from labor force participation. And this is, for the most part, not the effect of aging, but it's the effect of declining labor force participation at all ages, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. But from this, you can calculate what the growth deficit is. So in the period from 1990 to 2006, Japan's growth deficit from demographics was minus 0.8%. Now, Japan currently, bear in mind, is struggling to grow at more than 1%, in spite of massive monetary and fiscal stimulus. So if you're facing a headwind of minus 0.8% and it's going to get worse, that's a big issue. In Italy, the growth rate was relatively, the deficit was small. In the later period, the growth rate deficit from demographics was 1.35%. Italy, it was over 1%. In the US, the growth rate deficit from demographics was 1.5%. But this, as I said, is not aging. It's something else that's going on in the workforce. Okay, so what's the something else? So this shows you labor force participation rates in 1990 and 2010 over the life cycle for the US. And what you see is that labor force participation rates shifted down. So the big puzzle for US policymakers, the big question is, why are prime age workers participating less? It's sort of at a historic low, labor force participation in those cohorts. And labor force participation of older workers has actually increased a bit. But in Japan, that's not the case. In Japan, labor force participation has kind of stayed more or less the same over the life cycle. Now, as you get more and more workers in the tail of this life cycle distribution, then you can understand what the effect of labor force participation rates declining is going to be. It's going to collapse sharply. One last picture, and that is the importance of the intensive margin. So in Japan, in this table, I showed you that the large effect due to changes at the intensive margin, changes in hours per work, and you don't have to do that to see it. You can just look at the data. This is hours of work, average hours of work in the US and Japan. The US has been flat. In Japan, it kind of collapsed beginning in the 1990s. Some of that was legislative changes, but it's just continued to decline as a consequence of the aging population. Now, how much of these growth differences can be explained by their demographics? So if the evolution of demographics is important, we ought to be able to project into the future what these demographic changes and what the future projected nature of cohort distributions, what impact that has for future economic growth. And what an economist wants to do, I'm not going to take you through the model. I'm going to just describe what an economist wants to do to get a good answer to this. And that is, you want to know, can we model this as a consequence of individual decision-making, of individual behavior? So can you describe a world that's driven by these demographic dynamics in which individuals are making individual labor supply savings decisions over their life cycle? They face life cycle path of earnings. They have decisions about how to adjust their labor supply at the intensive and extensive margin. These are things we know how to do. And if such a model accounts for the kind of arithmetic we saw in the solo growth accounting, then perhaps we can use that model to project into the future what the baked in demographics are going to imply about Japan's growth in the future. I'll skip these slides about the model of demography and preferences and so on. Anybody who wants more, I will give it to you. But I will just rush to some conclusions because I'm almost out of time and I'm almost on time. And they are the following. The demographic deficit is potentially a very significant headwind for the world's economies. And it's a very important factor in the economies of Japan and Italy in particular. So where this model seems to work best is for countries like Japan and Italy, which have these kind of extreme case demographics, rapidly aging, rapidly rising dependency ratios. So an economic model does a reasonable job of capturing these things. My preliminary estimates for Japan suggest that by 2050, the demographic deficit for Japan is going to be over 2%, minus 2.2%. Now, this is an issue. This is a problem because demographics are baked in. You can't decide, well, at least we tend not to, that we don't want to have so many old people. There's a movie called, what was it called, Soylent Green or something, that imagines people being given these tablets to get rid of old unproductive workers. Anyway, that's an old movie, horror movie. We don't do that, that's what I'm saying. So we're not going to change the demographics as an act of public policy. So what do you do? Well, there are things you can do. Policy options include encouraging immigration. People have been saying that about Japan for years. The Japanese culture is averse to that. And so they haven't done it, and that's not really part of their plan. You can increase female labor force participation, something the US did a lot over a couple of decades. That's part of Mr. Abe's third arrow of economic reform, is to try to dramatically increase female labor force participation and make it easier for women to both work and have babies. You can change retirement and pension policies to encourage labor force participation later in life to take advantage of improved morbidity, that is improved healthiness of older workers, like myself. We can still work. But the set of policy options for addressing demographic problems are really different from the ones that we normally think of. But they're no less important, particularly when you're facing significant headwinds from something that's kind of baked into the economy by individual behavior. I thank you very much for listening to me today, and welcome.
Thanks for a very thoughtful and provoking lecture. Barcelona GSE is a young institution, and we're going to contribute by improving the human capital, okay, in the international world. It's just small, but that's what we can do. And we want to, as a closing, today's ceremony, we have the honor to have the Secretary of Universities of the Generalitat of Barcelona, Antoni Castellà.
Thanks, Professor Marimon, General Secretary of the Pompeu Fabra University, Vice Rector of International Policy of Autonomous University, Mr. Roderick Fernandez, Professor Cooley. First of all, of course, I have to say I have to thank to the organization just to participate in this ceremony, and because the ceremony is quite important, as is the inauguration of the course, but also because the institution. And I think that every year, in the last 5 years, I think more or less I've been here every year. And illustrious speakers like Professor Cooley give their lectures. And most of the times that surpass the economist sphere and exceed even the academic interest. And I think that today is, again, one of these days. Talking about demographics, like Professor Cooley said, I think it's been very interesting. And as he said, I was reading before preparing a little bit these few words some years ago, an article in Forbes magazine. He said demographics is often overlooked, but is at the heart of the fiscal and social problems that conform the mature economies and emerging markets. Indeed, it has to do with production, markets, health, talent, education, social development as a whole, so quite important also, or strategically important for the policymakers. And the social development had been challenged by the economic crisis we have been undergoing in the past 8 years. And as we think about the European Union has put the social development at the very center of its strategy for a smart, sustainable, and inclusive economy. Of course, you know I'm talking about the European 2020 Horizon. And indeed being research, innovation, and higher education at the very core of this strategy. So in these few words, I would like just to link a little bit these ideas of here in Europe demography and competitiveness, because this is a unique moment for the Europe, but also for Catalonia, since we are carving out international position in many different ways. Politics, talent, competitiveness, a consideration then of democracy versus competitiveness, as Professor Cooley said today, might be adequate. Europe, you were talking about that also, but Europe is in the middle of a race of talent. In most recent calculation, I just look about a few examples, calculations from the European Commission, and we estimate that we will need between 300,000 and 700,000 workers in the information and communication technology sector, for instance, only in 2015, this year. And 1 million healthcare professionals by 2020, most probably. So unless attractive measures are in place, Europe might lose out. Actually, mobile people will be increasing attracted by faster growing economies, and therefore some traditional destinations in Western Europe might face a stronger competition from countries like China. The global race for talent and skills will get more difficult as more countries actively search for highly qualified experts from abroad. And besides, lower private and public spending on research is likely to have a significant impact on the capability of countries to attract and retain talents in the longer term. Actually, there is a strong correlation between highly skilled migration and research and development expenditure, both meaning public and private. But what is the situation in Catalonia? If we look a little bit of the figures of Catalonia, we, as you know, we are 7.5 million people. Let's say that more babies were born nowadays than 30 years ago. In 20 years between 1998 and 2008, the population of Catalonia has increased 1.5 million people due to immigration, of course. That's been the process. In the 11th century, the weight of Catalonia in the world has been increased. Actually, Catalonia's population has grown proportionally more than the world's population. 1 of every 1,000 world's inhabitants is Catalan nowadays. And besides this demographic scenario, we are now in a moment of maximum offer of young, active global population. The democratic balance for Catalonia is thus positive, and the population graph has changed its shape from the pyramid displayed in 1985 to the robust of quiet shape obtained in 2013, being the most abundant ages in population between 35 and 40 years old. Besides, Catalonia is quite interesting for foreign top talent, according to some of facts, especially, and we're talking now in a research-oriented school, as far as research, more of 50% of the scientific positions in all levels, from postgraduate to career contracts, come here from foreign researchers. And this school, the Graduate in Barcelona, is a good example. I think that the core of the school is composed for world-class economists who could be in any other center of economics in the world, but have chosen Catalonia, especially this school. So I think that thanks to an open aptitude and commitment with knowledge, Catalonia has become a knowledge hub in the south of Europe. This state, or the state, we think deeply, nowadays the state of a nation is no more than no less than the function of what its people create. With the right policies, especially knowledge, can become the right economic driver. Catalonia is well positioned, both demographically and for its aiming at competitiveness. And I deeply think that the Graduate Barcelona School is one of the good examples. Ramon Marimon says some figures before, because your orientation of attracting talent, the position of publications, the great situation of your researchers. I think you said that you have more than 90% of the students are coming from abroad, more or less 60 different countries, and 80% of the GSE professors had obtained a PhD abroad of this country. So those are good figures. That's a good example of the institutions that we have right away in Barcelona. So finally, therefore, for all the above, let me just finish referring to the unique moment you all are living here as students that you want to start. This is a moment that will for sure be part of your training and for your vital experience here in Barcelona. I think that also would be very interesting for you just seeing that is a unique political process now here in Catalonia. It's a democratic, a bottom-up process. I like to say that it's just a process that a new state in Europe is born, and that will be part also of your life here in these days here. So take profit of it, open your minds, like the Scottish physicist James Dewar said about 100 years ago, more or less. Minds are like parachutes. They only work when they are open. So open it. Thank you very much.